Hey guys, welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then what is up? My name is Erica. Hey, how you doing? Today marks the start of a new series here on the channel, which is titled A Case For. This is an ongoing series here on the channel where I'm going to be diving into famous film and TV adaptations of the ancient world. So the plan is to leave no stone left unturned in my analysis of these various projects that I'll be diving into. But before we can get into the meat of today's episode, please do not forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you know every single time I post in the future. And so, without further ado, I'd like to give you the first episode in A Case for Troy. So let's begin with giving you guys a little bit of context for the movie before diving right into today's episode, which will be a rundown of the film's action versus the mythology. There will be no cross-analysis in this video. It will just be explanation of both sides, just to get everybody up to speed, really. So we do a couple of housekeeping notes, make sure that everybody's on the same wavelength, so that way throughout the series, we can all refer back to this video. And I will constantly be being like, if you watch the first episode, all of us. Again, we're just gonna bring everybody up to speed. So Troy itself was released in 2004, and the film was directed by Wolfgang Petersen, who is famous for films like Das Boot and Air Force One, and it was written by David Benioff, who is one of the guys that is responsible for the absolute dumpster fire that was Game of Thrones. Now, the project stars the likes of Brad Pitt, Eric Bana, Orlando Bloom, Rose Byrne, Diane Kruger, and Peter O'Toole, to name but a few of these absolute crazy celebrities that are in this film, and all of them are now some of Hollywood's elite, obviously bar Peter O'Toole, RIP. According to IMDb, Petersen's Troy cost a total of $175 million to make and grossed over $400 million when it was released worldwide. Now, it's important to remember that at the time of release, swords and sandal epics were making a comeback to the big screen thanks to the likes of Gladiator, which was released in the year 2000 and did incredibly well. So Troy also takes the most famous story from ancient Greek mythology, and that was a natural course of action for them to take after seeing what Gladiator would have done, which was Rome. They were obviously going to go to Greece, and they were going to be like, what's the most famous story for us to do to create an epic that would be a blockbuster hit, much like Gladiator was. The Trojan War is one of the most famous stories ever, and it was turned into a 2-hour, nearly 3-hour long cinematic piece of art. Now, the story, obviously, as you can tell from the title, is the legend of Troy and the battle that took place there in ancient antiquity and mythology. And we'll be getting into the nitty-gritty of the source material throughout this series. So please bear with me for right now, because all I'm going to tell you is that the Battle of Troy was the most momentous war to have ever been sung, written, or spoken about in all of history. Our primary source for this battle is the Iliad, which was a text that was written by Homer in around 750-ish BC, although the story itself that Homer does tell us is set in around 1200-1100 BC, which is known as the late Bronze Age of Greek history. So the Iliad details a really small window in the Trojan War, right? It's in the 9th year of the Trojan War. It only spans about 6 to 8 weeks actually in real time of action. And it details the Greek siege of Troy as they battled to rescue Helen after she ran away with the Trojan prince by the name of Paris. But again, more on this later. I'll be going into the mythology and the film in just a hot second. But basically what I'm trying to tell you is that the grandeur of this story meant that, of course, Hollywood was going to want to take it in, chew it up, and then spit it back out, which it did. Upon release, though, the film was met with varying reviews, shall we say. That's a really nice way of saying that. There were lots of different voices speaking up in regards to the film. We have the Washington Post that said, just don't go into Troy expecting adherence to the subtler details of the Iliad. The Daily Telegraph took this one step further, calling the film a disgrace. As an adaptation of the Iliad, it's a pathetic joke. And the Hollywood Reporter continued this comparison to Homer, writing that the film loses the story's sense of fate, destiny, and tragedy. But probably the worst review that I found in all of my research about the film Troy comes from the Chicago Sun-Times, which wrote, Troy is based on an epic poem, The Iliad, by Homer, and Homer's estate should sue. That is pretty fucking grim by any standard. But don't worry, if you guys really love the film, there were also some nice reviews of the film. So for example, the Daily Screen said, if in the end, Troy fails to stir the heart as much as it dazzles the eye, it is nevertheless one of the most intelligent and ambitious blockbusters to have come out of Hollywood in some time, while the San Francisco Chronicle published, the precedent for Pitt's Achilles is not to be found in Homer, but in the Hollywood anti-heroes of the 1970s. Pit is magnetic. But for all of you kiddos who, like me, only really trust Rotten Tomatoes gave the film a 53% in critics rating, but it got a 73% in audience rating. So now that we've done a little bit of backstory, now that we've done a little bit contextual, evidence, and we're all up to speed with one another, I should probably tell you guys exactly how this series is going to be structured throughout the coming weeks and the coming months, probably, because the series is long. As I said, no stone is going to be left unturned, and so there is a lot of ground to cover. I'm a classicist, right? So I really like overanalyzing things. I love comparing things, contrasting things, figuring out where things come from. So I've definitely gone down a few too many rabbit holes in the preparation for this series. But even though it feels like there's going to be a million episodes, they will be split into 3 basic categories, each and every episode of analysis. So 3 categories of analysis, which each video is going to come under. The first section, which includes this video, will be discussing more so the overall storyline of the film and contrasting and comparing it to the ancient mythology. So I'm not only going to be using the film itself, but also we're going to be using a lot of the script. So quoting directly from the script, things that I found there. And we're going to be contrasting it to the Iliad, to the Odyssey, to the Aeneid, wherever I see fit, whichever part of the history it's from. So this is not only going to include just the storyline, but it's also going to include a lot of character analysis. I'm laughing because it sounds absolutely absurd that I've gone into this much detail for one film, but I have. So we're going to be doing character analysis. We will also be doing, comparison of death scenes, comparison of battle scenes in general. We're going to be comparing, contrasting the army, all of that sort of stuff. So it will be the general story with the mythology in section 1. Section 2 will just be the costume design, because I thought I could do that with the characters. I can't. That is a whole other can of worms. So it gets its own little structural playlist, shall we say. Not an actual playlist, this is all gonna be one playlist, but either way, that's gonna be the costume design is section 2. And then section 3 is going to be the set design of the film Troy, because again, that is a whole other part to the film that there is just far too much. As soon as I started getting into it, there's gonna be a couple of videos for that specifically. Throughout the discussion of Troy from 2004, I will not only be using the ancient source material and the film in order to discuss the adaptations and the changes and all of this sort of stuff, but I will also be quoting actual members of staff who worked on the film, the production team, the director. All of those people will have a voice in this series. Not personally, I've just found a lot of interviews that they did at the time discussing what went on. Obviously, Wolfgang Petersen is not with us, is not in this world anymore. So again, RIP, all respect to him. And I want to give them all the time to say their piece, because I did hear a bunch of things in the behind the scenes and all of that sort of stuff that really did change my opinion of certain elements of the film. Because hearing that, I understood the, a lot of the monetary issues, a lot of the struggles that film sets have, and I understand that. And so a lot of things we've allowed, and I want to give those the voice and make sure that this video series is much more weighted and much more balanced, because I think it would be really easy for me to just kind of dive into this and to be like, it's all rubbish, it's all not accurate. Whereas if we at least let the film production team speak for themselves and explain why certain things might have been changed or adapted in certain ways, maybe we can all come to some sort of, logical middle ground of agreement. I hope. Anyways, that's kind of what I hope from doing this series, and I hope that I have effectively communicated this more so balanced argument to you guys throughout the series, because again, as a classicist, historically, there's not a lot of good things in there, but I don't want to only be harping on those. I do want to make sure that it is balanced, make sure that we're all the same wavelength. And so in saying all of that, because I'm just going to keep repeating myself because I'm trying my best here, you guys. But in saying that, the next part of the video, we should just roll into that now. And we're going to be discussing the film and the mythology. So I will first of all start off by giving you guys a breakdown of the film action, and then we will roll into the mythology from the ancient source material, so that way we all have the basic sort of framework going into this analysis of both the ancient source material and the film. So let's roll into it. We're going to be going into the action of the film first and foremost before diving into the legend of the mythology that comes from the ancient Greek world, just so that the film is fresh in everybody's mind. But you know what? If you guys are film buffs, if you guys have watched this really recently and you don't need to watch this part because you can remember exactly what happens in the film, do not worry. I'll be putting a timestamp down in the description below for you guys to jump to if you guys just want to hear the mythology. So let's just dive into the action of the film. The action opens with a huge Greek army, and it's advancing on the Thessalonians. Now, Agamemnon and the Thessalonian king, who is a guy named Triopas, I'm honestly I can't remember off the top of my head how you pronounce it. I think it's Triopas, but anyways, the two of them agree to have their best men fight one another, as opposed to having both armies engage in some crazy, massive battle, and there's going to be like crazy bloodshed and all of that sort of stuff. No, they just decide that their best warriors will fight each other. They're going to avoid all of that, and whoever wins this mini battle is then going to win this little war. It's actually quite a big war between the Greeks and the Thessalonians, because that's really what they're putting forward, just so you guys know. It's the Greeks versus the Thessalonians, which is the last part of Greece that apparently Agamemnon has not yet conquered. So Achilles from the Greek side faces off with this guy called Boagrius, who's this giant Viking-looking man of the Thessalonian army, and obviously Achilles wins, and so therefore the Thessalonians are now absorbed into Agamemnon's army. But after this, the action cuts to Sparta, where we meet King Menelaus and his wife Helen, and the two of them are entertaining the Trojans, who are led by the princes Hector and Paris. Now, halfway through the festivities, as we see them, dancing around and all this sort of stuff in the palace at Sparta, we then see Paris slip off. He slips up the stairs. Hector notices this, and then we see, shock horror as the audience, we see that Paris has been having an affair with Helen, the king's wife, right under his nose in his own house. After we see a little bit of action, shall we say, from the pair, Paris manages to convince Helen to get in the boat with him and to go back to Troy alongside him. The action then fast forward to Hector and Paris as they are en route back to Troy. And when Paris tells his brother Hector that, Helen is on the frickin' boat with them and is just below so that nobody knows, and they've stolen her from Sparta, Hector is obviously really, really pissed off. In fact, he's absolutely raging. But in this moment, he does not turn the ship around because he notices that Paris is like a little bit unhinged. Paris starts saying things like, "I'm willing to fight Menelaus for the love of my life." All of this rubbish, basically, that even Hector knows, well, you can't fight Menelaus. He's a really great warrior, whatever. Basically, Hector decides the best course of action in this moment is to not bring Helen back, but instead to just bring her to Troy with them, since they're already halfway there. The damage is already done. While that is all happening, we see Menelaus, who is back in Sparta, and he has now found out that Helen is gone. And to say that he's mad is it's an understatement, right? Menelaus is so pissed off. He's infuriated. He immediately stomps his way all the way from Sparta up to Mycenae and begs his brother Agamemnon to get his army, because remember, Agamemnon has this massive army for seemingly no reason, but he's got this huge army, and so Menelaus says, "Can you get your army to come with me all the way to Troy to get Helen back?" And Agamemnon says, "Sure." It's now that the film introduces the character of Odysseus, who is sent to go and collect Achilles from his home on, everybody who watches this channel knows I struggle with this word, Pythia or Phthia? I'm honestly not really sure, but anyways, they go to Achilles' home in order to persuade him to go into battle with the Greeks against the Trojans. Now, when Odysseus presents this idea to Achilles, Achilles isn't too thrilled about it, and so he goes to his mother, who's a woman called Thetis, to go and chat to her about the whole ordeal, to get some motherly wisdom about what he should do in this scenario. Now, Thetis relays to him this prophecy where she says that if he is going to go to Troy and he's going to fight, then he will be remembered forever, but he's going to die really young. But the other prophecy is that he is going to stay home and he's going to have this really boring life, and nobody will remember him. So it's either, she tells him, you're picking between glory forever and a really short life, or a really long life, and no one gives a fuck who you are. Achilles obviously ends up picking the whole, shorter life and glory and all of this. So he gets on his boat and he goes to Troy with all of the men. Now the action cuts to the city of Troy, where everyone is celebrating the return of Hector and Paris. And alongside Paris, in this little cute chariot that they're riding into the city, stands Helen. They ride through all the people and they ride all the way to Priam's palace. So Priam is the king of Troy. He is introduced to Helen. He's initially as Helen of Sparta, and Orlando Bloom is Helen of Troy. But whilst that's happening, we then also see Hector, who gets reunited with his wife Andromache and their son. And as well in this scene, we have the character of Briseis, who is introduced as the cousin of Hector and Paris in this film. So she then runs through, and she's also introduced as the priestess of Apollo. The following day, an alarm sounds in Troy because the lookouts from the little towers have noticed the Greek ships that are appearing on the horizon. Okay, so the Trojans armor up, as you would do. They armor up and they go down to the beach as Achilles' ship. So Achilles is at the front and his ship is running in, it's sailing in really, really fast to the beaches of Troy. It's heading straight for the shore. And instead of waiting, instead of Achilles being like, oh, we should probably backpedal a little bit, we're out here by ourselves, Achilles decides he's going to go on a suicide mission. And so he brings him and his myrmidons, his single ship, into the Bay of Troy. So they all go onto the beach, they all come out, and they decide to head in for an attack completely alone. Achilles and his men are met by the Trojans when they ultimately take the beach, and then further, Hector and Achilles actually meet in this moment when they go to this temple of Apollo that's a little bit higher up than the beach. So they go up there, they have this like one-on-one, and then Achilles chops off a statue of Apollo's head. A statue of Apollo, yes, that does make sense. So he chops off that statue's head. He says that the god of the sun, Apollo, is their enemy, and then the Trojans retreat. Probably because they think that Achilles is a madman for doing that. But anyways, more on that in the rest of the series. The rest of the Greek army now arrive on the beach to set up camp, and Achilles meets Briseis in this moment because she was taken from the temple of Apollo and is now given, well, not really given, she's just sort of brought down to Achilles because he's the one that sacked the beach and the temple of Apollo. So now Briseis is then shown to Achilles. Achilles brings her back to the tent, all of this sort of stuff. And later on, the next important thing, later on, a few scenes later, that Achilles is called to Agamemnon's tent, where he sees that, oh my goodness, Agamemnon has stolen Briseis from his tent. The horror! Achilles is super mad, and as we've seen throughout the film up until this point, there is a lot of harbored hatred that Achilles has for Agamemnon, so this one act pushes Achilles over the edge. But before we can see Achilles' reaction, we do cut to the Trojans, because the Trojans are having a meeting to decide whether they should engage in battle with the Greeks at all. I mean, what are the odds that they're going to win against the Greeks? And that's sort of what they're all chatting about. And Paris in this meeting, he's sort of sitting there, with his brother and his dad and all of these like big Trojan officials. And Paris just decides he's going to offer himself up on a platter. He tells all of them that he wants to just fight Menelaus. It's their fight anyways. And so they are going to fight it out for Helen one-on-one. And obviously, everybody's pretty happy about this. All of the elders are praising Paris. Hector's even praising Paris, all of this sort of stuff. And so the meeting disperses, everybody's in a good mood. And later on in the evening, Paris is sitting down in like the courtyard of Priam's palace. Priam walks up to him and gives him the sword of Troy. And he awards his son with this sword and is like, this is a symbol of the city's power and strength and blah, blah, and you can fight with it now. And Paris is like, oh, the sword of Troy. The following morning though, back at the Greek camp, Achilles now refuses to fight until Agamemnon begs him to come back into battle. So Achilles instructs the rest of his army, who are known as the Myrmidons, to stay in the camp with him, which none of them are thrilled about. In particular, Patroclus is really pissed off that they're all forced to stay because Achilles is having a bit of a moody moment. But the next scene of importance is that Paris does fight Menelaus, and then Hector comes into the one-on-one fight that they're having. Hector sort of slides in and he kills Menelaus on the battlefield in front of both of the armies. After this death, a huge fight breaks out between the two armies after Menelaus is killed. So Hector then meets Ajax, who's a really famous Greek warrior, Greek hero, all of those sorts of things. So Ajax is really famous, and Hector in the film meets him on the battlefield and kills him as well. But lots of men die in this scene, and it's because of this that during the night, so the next scene that we see is then a nighttime scene where lots of fires, like, those funeral pyres and everything like that, are now lighting up both the Greek camp and the city of Troy as they burn and honor their respective dead. We then get a really small snippet right now of Paris and Helen, who are having a moment together. But the most important part of this time of the film is the meeting between Agamemnon, Nestor, and Odysseus, because the three of them come to meet, and after some convincing by Nestor and Odysseus, Agamemnon finally agrees to give Briseis back to Achilles because they realize that they need Achilles in battle, especially now that Ajax has just died. They don't say that, but it's implied. Ajax has just died. No one is safe, so they definitely need Achilles. However, and this is a really weird part of the film, we then cut to see Briseis, who's not in Agamemnon's tent anymore. She's actually on the beach. She's sort of being thrown around between a bunch of Greek soldiers. And then Achilles comes out of nowhere, picks her up over his shoulder, brings her back to his tent as like this valiant, knight in shining armor, minus the shining armor part, obviously, because this is the ancient world. But they then, Achilles and Briseis, have this romantic moment. It's kind of odd because then Briseis, after they get like super lovey-dovey and all of this, then Briseis does threaten to stab him. So that does happen, meaning the relationships are still a little bit rocky, but they do have a moment. This is the start of something beautiful. The following day though, Achilles tells his men that they are actually going to be going home, right? right? So even though he has Briseis, he still doesn't want to fight. He just wants to go back to his homeland to go and see his dad. And so Patroclus, again, starts fighting him on this. And Patroclus is a bit like, we should be going out into war. This is what we're here for. We can't just go home. But Achilles does not listen. And right after this announcement, actually, Odysseus appears at Achilles' tent in a bid to convince him to come back into war. His arguments are a little bit odd because Odysseus is like, oh, you don't want Agamemnon as an enemy, and think of all of the men you can save, and all of this sort of stuff, which does not work on Achilles, unsurprisingly. But the action now cuts to that evening, and Achilles and Briseis are having yet another really romantic moment. But their romantic moment is actually very rudely interrupted by a night raid that is being led by the Trojans. There are lots of these burning balls that are rolling down the beach and all of this. It's very destructive, and Achilles and Briseis, again, cute moment, and they're just like, oh shit, we're being attacked. But this night raid then carries on into a morning raid where then all of a sudden the armies now meet when it's daybreak. So right at the start of the day, it's still kind of dark. The armies now meet on the battlefield, and suddenly, as they're all fighting, Achilles emerges from the tent. Thank goodness. And so Achilles and Hector, naturally Hector steps up to the plate, and they then meet for a duel on the battlefield where Hector actually slits Achilles' throat. And so Achilles, falls to the ground. And when he's standing over him, when Hector is standing over Achilles, they take off his helmet and realize that it is not Achilles. It is revealed that Patroclus is actually wearing Achilles' armor and is now below Hector. And Hector just finishes him off, knowing that this is Patroclus. And then he tells Odysseus and tells the rest of the army that they will not fight for the rest of the day, that this is it. This is as far as it goes. So both sides end up going to their respective, either the city of Troy, or they go to the camps where the Greeks are staying. And it's Eudorus who is the man that delivers the news to Achilles of Patroclus' death. Now, Achilles says probably my favorite line in this scene when he hears about all of this happening, and Eudorus is sort of breaking the news to him. Brad Pitt, aka Achilles, goes, Patroclus. But anyways, we cut to Hector, and Hector is showing his wife Andromache in this scene these underground passages of the city of Troy, so that way she knows if and when Troy is taken, how she's going to survive and how she's going to exit the city. But back at the Greek camp then, Patroclus receives his burial rites and he is placed on a pyre and then burned. The next morning though, Achilles and Hector are seen very dramatically, you guys. They're seen putting on their armor, and Achilles rides over to the walls of Troy and he starts screaming for Hector. He's like, Hector! Super dramatically, trying to get Hector out of the walls. Finally, Hector comes out. They end up in this massive duel, and then obviously Hector is killed by Achilles, and then he has 2 holes punched in his heels, where then Achilles ties him to his chariot and then drives his chariot away from the city of Troy back to the Greek camps with Hector's body bobbing about behind him. That night though, Priam, who is the king of Troy, goes to Achilles' tent in order to beg him for his son's body back. Now, Achilles has a really touching moment where he cries with Priam, and then he does agree to give Hector back. And whilst he gives the body of Hector back, he also says to Priam that he can take Briseis, because remember, Briseis is technically his niece, so he says you can take her back with you as well. Obviously, Agamemnon is not thrilled about this, and what makes Agamemnon even more mad is that Achilles had told Priam that he could have 12 days in order to bury and honor his son and all of the other lost members of Troy. And again, Agamemnon is super, super pissed by this. But as this is happening, we cut to Odysseus, who we see sitting actually around the campfire with a bunch of other Greek soldiers that we don't know. And one of them is whittling out of wood this little toy of a horse for his son back home. And Odysseus gets the brilliant idea of making the Trojan horse. After what is presumably 12 days, the film does not tell you, but I presume it's 12 days, we see the Trojans who go to investigate the Greek camp. After we see a shot of somebody on horseback who's running up to the gates of Troy, presumably to tell them that there are no Greeks where the Greeks once were. When all of the Trojans arrive at the beach, they see a bunch of dead bodies, a bunch of Greek dead bodies, which they assume is actually a plague that was sent by Apollo. And of course, amongst all of the dead bodies, they see no camp, but they do see a giant wooden horse. Now, the Trojans assume that this is an offering to the god Poseidon for safe passage. Oh my god! Presumably it's safe passage, right? That's what they think that they have left it to, was safe passage across the sea, and they have offered it to Poseidon because he's god of the sea. And so the Trojans then want to take this into the city. They see this giant thing, they're like, that's really cool, we should take that back into the city. But only Paris says that it could possibly be a trap. However, none of the Trojans listen to him. But that night, of course, the Greeks break out of the Trojan horse and they go to ransack the city. Now, a few things happen to round off the film, right? So we've got Achilles, who only runs through the city to go and to find Briseis, which is really weird. But she actually, right before Achilles finds her, she kills Agamemnon in Troy. And then right before that, we actually see Agamemnon killing Priam. So Priam dies, killed by Agamemnon, and then Briseis kills Agamemnon, and then Achilles goes to meet Briseis, right? So just so that we all know what that little death timeline is. We then see Andromache and Helen fleeing the city of Troy via the underground tunnels, and Paris is sort of, ushering everybody out. Paris also comes into contact with a very young boy whose name is Aeneas, and Paris gives him the sword of Troy in order to continue on the Trojan race in some other part. And Aeneas is literally like 15, or he's like a child in this scene. But anyways, he then leaves. And the next time we see Paris is when he is actually going to shoot Achilles, because he kills Achilles. He shoots an arrow into the back of Achilles' heel and then shoots a bunch into Achilles' chest as Briseis is holding him, and so Achilles dies in Briseis' arms. And that concludes the action of the film. So now that we are all up to date with Troy from 2004, I thought the best way to get everybody up to speed was to then go through all of the mythology in the same way that I just went through the action of the film. Now you guys are going to get it all from the mythological point of view. I'm just going to tell you guys the story. So this is where, hello, all of you guys who were the film buffs are now tuning back in. We're going to go through the mythology from the ancient source material of exactly what the Trojan War was before I start cross-analyzing in future episodes. So let's roll into the myth. Okay, let's get nerdy. So technically, this whole messy mythological story begins with the Greek gods, because what doesn't begin with the Greek gods in Greek mythology? That's a very obvious thing to say. Well done, Erica. But this one really begins with this beautiful sea nymph by the name of Thetis. Now, Thetis, at one point or the other in her mythology, she receives a prophecy that states that her son is going to grow up to be better than his father. Thetis at this point does not have a son, so this is a future prophecy of what's going to happen. Now, a lot of gods were really interested in courting Thetis and marrying her, including Zeus, the king of the gods, and Poseidon, the king of the sea, right? So the god of the sea, the god of the skies, both of them super interested. But when they hear this prophecy, obviously the interest goes kaput. Not only from the two of them, but also from all of the other gods. They all just kind of disperse, right? And Zeus, because he's the king of the gods, he takes on his kingly role and he decides he's going to marry Thetis off to a mortal. And that way there will be no risk of her child being better than any of the other gods. So who does Zeus marry her off to? But this mortal by the name of Peleus. So at the pair's wedding, at Peleus and Thetis' wedding, all of the gods are in attendance, right? Everybody shows up, they're looking their best, looking their sharpest. Well, okay, I say that. All the gods but Eris, who's goddess of discord, are invited, and Eris is not invited, and she finds out the hard way that everybody's having a great time at this wedding. And naturally, Eris, without even being notified that there's a wedding in the first place, right? No one has told her. She's pretty pissed off, naturally. In fact, Eris is so pissed off in this moment that she decides to go to the wedding when she hears the festivities. She shows up anyways with a literal trick up her sleeve. Now, what is this trick? The trick is a golden apple, and on the golden apple is engraved into it Te Kaliste, which in English, because that's Greek, translate to the fairest. So Eris shows up to the party and she pulls out the golden apple and just rolls it into the middle of the crowd. That's it. Very, very simple action. And all this does is it gets three gods' attention. So the three gods who see the apple and believe that they are the fairest and therefore the apple belongs to them are Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite. So Athena is the goddess of water strategy. Hera is the queen of the gods. She's the goddess of marriage. She's married to Zeus. And Aphrodite is the goddess of love. The three of them have an initial tussle over it. They're all trying to, vouch for why they're the fairest of them all, but they cannot come up with an agreement, basically, that none of them can agree who the apple belongs to. So they decide to go to Zeus, and they say, hey, you have to pick who's the fairest of them all. Give the apple to one person. And Zeus, very, very cleverly, he goes, I am not getting into this. There is no way I'm getting involved. I refuse to choose. However, what you guys should do is find a mortal to choose. Go down, find a totally unbiased mortal, because you guys are literally my children and my wife, so not really appropriate for me to choose. Ask a random mortal and see what he says. And so Zeus actually points down to Earth and he points out this random totally random mortal, and that guy happens to be Paris. Now, this is what is known as the Judgment of Paris in Greek mythology. So all of the goddesses go down to the field, they go down to talk to Paris and present themselves to him, and also bribe him with something so that he is more inclined to pick them as the fairest, right? This is all about a fucking golden apple. Bear that in mind. It's literal in the mythology. It can sometimes be figurative, but that's not for this episode. You just need to know it as like a literal thing. They want the apple, so all the goddesses are like, here's something that you could possibly want, and if you choose me, I'll give you this. The most important one that you guys need to know, though, is Aphrodite's bribe. And she tells Paris that if he picks her as the fairest of them all, then she will give him the most beautiful woman in the world to marry and to be his forever and ever. And naturally, you know, Paris is in like his late 20s, his early 30s at this point. He is a very young man. He is very easily distracted. And so naturally he picks up the apple and he gives it straight to Aphrodite and goes, where's the lady? Which is really unfortunate because Paris is actually married at this point. He's married to this woman called Oenone. But anyways, do you, Paris? So that is all one side of the mythology, right? But I need to catch you up with the other side before these two stories can converge until we get to Troy, because after this moment with Paris, we then head into the Trojan War. So right before that, let's explain the other part of the mortal story, which also begins with the gods, again, obviously. Now, this part of the mythology begins with Zeus. So Zeus, one day, he's sitting on Olympus and he looks down to earth and he sees this really beautiful lady by the name of Leda, and he's just like, I gotta hook up with her because she's super hot and I must have her now. He takes on the guise of a swan, he comes down to earth and he hooks up with Leda. However, what's important for you guys to know is that Leda has a husband who is immortal, he's a king, right? So he's a king of Sparta, Leda is therefore the queen of Sparta, and she hooks up with a swan. And where the pregnancy comes into it and the birthing of the children of Zeus and the children of Tyndareus is sort of where mythology gets a little bit murky. What we're just going to tell you for this video, though, because it's very basic, is that Leda lays 2 eggs. So in one of the eggs contain twin boys. So we have Castor and Pollux. So one of them is the son of Tyndareus and one of them is the son of Zeus. And then we have in the other egg, Clytemnestra and Helen. One is the daughter of Zeus, one is the daughter of Tyndareus. Obviously, Helen is the daughter of Zeus, and that is where Helen comes from. Because Helen is half divine, she is half the daughter of Zeus, she is therefore absolutely gorgeous. She's basically radiating divine energy. She is known very, very quickly as the most beautiful woman in the world as she grows up. That is the reputation that comes with her. After this, we're going to fast forward through mythology a little bit to get to the important stuff, because there's some childhood stuff with Helen that doesn't actually impact the Trojan War, but where we should just, drop you guys into is when Helen is now of age to get married. So when Helen is of age, her mortal father, because Zeus, he f***s off, he's Zeus. So her mortal father, Tyndareus, tells all the kings of the neighboring kingdoms and islands that Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, is now ready to get married. So if you guys want to marry her, you've got to come and compete in these competitions, and then we will pick the best man to have the job of being Helen's husband and therefore the future king of Sparta. Naturally, everybody shows up, right? Every famous man from mythology that you can possibly think of from this time period shows up to court Helen. And when they're all there competing in the games, it is noticed that a number of the men are getting a little territorial of Helen and quite competitive. With the other men, it's getting a little bit dangerous. And the hero who notices this is Odysseus. He can see that the air is quite tense, it's potentially violent. And so as a way of protecting everybody, he comes up with this idea of an oath. And he tells all of the heroes that they're going to swear an oath that says that none of them are going to steal Helen from whoever rightfully wins her hand. None of them are going to have an affair with her, any of this sort of stuff. Whoever Helen and her father pick as her husband is therefore going to be respected by all of the other kings. Now, this obviously is in everybody else's interest because all of them believe that they're going to win Helen's hand. But further, Odysseus says that they all must agree that if anybody is to go against this, and if somebody's gonna, swoop in from God knows where and be like, nope, I'm taking Helen, she's coming to my kingdom, we're gonna have an affair with her and all of this, no matter what happens, all of the men who then agree to this oath are then going to band together to punish the one man that breaks the oath, if that makes sense. So basically the oath is saying that we are all protecting Helen and Helen's future husband. So they are going to be respected as a couple. No one is going to come in and steal Helen, because this is something that happened before, by the way. But that's something that we're not going to get into. You can Google that, because Helen is stolen away at one point, and Odysseus is trying to make sure that that does not happen again. So all of the men swear the oath. Again, they all believe they're going to marry Helen. This is a great deal. It's just really, really unfortunate that when they're all making this deal, No one assumed that a foreign prince or a foreign king was going to show up. Somebody who had no idea that the oath was made is going to show up and steal Helen. So it was just like a nice idea, basically. Just terrible execution, but nice idea. Menelaus is the man who does end up winning Helen though, and he therefore becomes the king of Sparta because Helen is now going to step into the role of being queen of Sparta. So Menelaus, who is Agamemnon's brother, ends up winning and ends up having a kingdom of his own. So we're gonna fast forward again through mythology because lots of stuff happens in the middle, but we're gonna fast forward to when Helen and Menelaus are now living their satisfactory lives, shall we say. It's not particularly happy. They have a daughter together. She is an active part of the mythology. They have a young daughter, and they're just, living a married life as being king and queen of Sparta. Unfortunately, this is when Paris enters the picture. Our foreign prince from Troy, having no knowledge of the oath, shows up in Sparta. Now, the mythology during this episode is again a little bit murky, but all you really need to know is that Paris, one way or the other, leaves with Helen after he goes to visit Sparta. There's a version in Homer's Iliad, which states that Helen was an unwilling participant in this whole abduction. She is totally taken against her will, and she's taken to Troy because Aphrodite, as I told you, right, so now we're sort of catching up because Aphrodite promised Paris that he could have the most beautiful woman in the world. Obviously that's Helen. Helen's married, so Paris naturally goes and picks up Helen against her will because it's the will of the gods. So that's one version of the story, but it's not every single version. There are some versions where she does go willingly into the boat. This is much later mythology, that Helen is, she does fall in love with Paris and she does leave because her life is really boring in Sparta. But there are really interesting versions of this story, which come from plays much, much, much later into history, which state that Helen never went to Troy at all. In fact, Helen was safely brought to Egypt and is there for the entirety of the Trojan War, and a mere phantom of her went with Paris to Troy, and that is what the men are fighting over. It's a very, very interesting commentary of war, but either way, it's just important that you guys know that there are lots of different versions, but the most important thing is that Helen, one way or another, she was in Sparta, married to Menelaus, and now she's not in Sparta and with another man. Obviously, when Helen is seen to be missing, Menelaus is super pissed, and the story in mythology goes quite quickly from that point where Menelaus is mad, he goes to see his brother Agamemnon. Agamemnon then remembers everybody who swore the oath. Menelaus remembers the oath as well, and then they go to gather up all of the men. And unfortunately though, rallying the army is a lot easier said than done. Okay, so even though there are lots of beats to this part, there are also little caveats which do tell us in mythology that a lot of the men did not want to go. They do not care about Helen. They do not care about Menelaus. They see it as something that is beyond them. Bear in mind, this is years and years after the courting of Helen. As I told you, she's already had a child with Menelaus. This child is already not a baby, it's getting older. And so when she leaves, lots of these men are married themselves. They have families, they have wives. They have zero interest in playing into this weird power dynamic between Menelaus and Agamemnon and Troy. They don't give a shit. Even Odysseus, okay, the guy who came up with the stupid oath in the first place, Odysseus has no interest in going for Troy. And in fact, when some of Agamemnon's men go to Ithaca to go and get Odysseus, he's one of the first, Odysseus pretends to be mad. He pretends to be crazy in order for him to be able to stay on Ithaca and to not go to war. Or the only way that they manage to get Odysseus to show his true colors, that he's, totally sane and not crazy, is that they pick up his young son, who's a baby, his baby Telemachus, and they put him in harm's way, purposely, so that Odysseus will snap out of his act and he'll go and save his son. And that's how the men are you're not insane, you swore an oath, you're coming to Troy. But he is not the only one. That Achilles, our quintessential hero, the most manly man from the ancient world, not even he wants to go to Troy. Remember how I mentioned Peleus and Thetis? Right, okay, so Achilles is their son, and when he is born, the parents receive two prophecies about what's gonna happen in his life. So the first one is that he will either live a really long life and no one's gonna remember him, but he's gonna be happy, he's gonna be very settled, he's gonna have a family, all of this sort of stuff. And the second prophecy is that he is going to live a very short life, but it's going to be very glorious and people will sing his name for years and generations to come. Okay, so these are with Achilles from the day that he's born. But his mother is terrified about this, and so when they hear about the Trojan War, Thetis sort of picks him up and plops him on the island of Skyros in order to hide him, so he's not home. Okay, so that way when the Greek heroes go to Phthia, whatever, however you say that place, he's not there. And Achilles himself also knows of his prophecy. Him, wholeheartedly, not just his mother, he does not want to go to Troy because he wants to live his very normal life. That's all Achilles wants to do. And so even on the island of Skyros, Achilles hides. And he doesn't hide in regards to, like hiding behind like a curtain or whatever, so that when the men come and find him, they've got to, do like a whole game of hide and seek. No, Achilles hides in plain sight, and he actually dresses up like a woman, and he hides among the ladies in the hall. So when Odysseus and Diomedes, who are the two heroes that come to pick up Achilles, when they show up, they have to trick him in order to reveal himself so that they can bring him to Troy with them. And that's also because those men, so Odysseus and Diomedes, they had gotten a prophecy as well. They had heard through the rumor mill that they would not win at Troy without Achilles. So they were not leaving the island without Achilles coming with them. So very long story short, they end up trapping Achilles, they end up tricking him. Achilles ends up picking up a spear and outing himself, no, not a spear, sorry, a sword, and outing himself as a warrior and therefore a man over the other ladies who don't pick up swords in the hall. It's a very long story, I'm not gonna get into it, but either way, Achilles outs himself, and so the men pick him up, and then they go to Troy with him. But I'm just mentioning that because it's important to know that Odysseus and Achilles are just two examples of men who did not want to go to the Trojan War, okay? Everybody tries to get out of it, and those are two of the most famous heroes, so I think that demonstrates it pretty well. Anyways, before the ships actually sail to Troy, they all sail down to the port of Aulis. Now, when they're at Aulis, they have to stay for a few days, and they sort of start, hunting in the surrounding woods and the surrounding area. And one day, when they're all getting geared up to go and leave and to sail on to Troy, there are no winds. There are no winds to take them. There are no winds going into the sails. So they're like, okay, well, we'll just wait another day. So they do. And then they wait another day and another day. And eventually the men are getting tired. Where have the winds gone? Why can't they sail to Troy? They've got a lady to go and pick up. And so Agamemnon, who's the overall king of the Greeks, he calls on his seer. Now, a seer, for you guys who don't know, is somebody who communicates directly with the gods in the ancient world. And Agamemnon's is a guy called Calchas. So Agamemnon speaks to Calchas and says, talk to the gods, figure out what we've done wrong so that we can get our little booties over to Troy and do what we set out to do. And Calchas says, okay. Calchas goes away, he speaks to the gods, and when he comes back, he brings Agamemnon really, really bad news. As it turns out, one day when all the men were hunting, Agamemnon had shot down a sacred deer to Artemis, who is the goddess of hunting, and her sacred animal are deers. And so Calchas relays this to Agamemnon and said, Artemis is really mad, so she wants a sacrifice from you. And Agamemnon says, okay, what does she want? Does she want an animal? Does she want, a hecatomb, which is sacrifice of like 100 bulls? He's like, what does she want? We're willing to do anything. And Calchas very solemnly tells Agamemnon that the sacrifice that Artemis is demanding of the king is his own daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon, being a war hero, obliges to what the goddess wants, and he tricks Iphigenia into coming from Mycenae to Aulis by telling her that she is to marry Achilles before the ships set sail for Troy. So Iphigenia, who's about 13, 14 at the time, she comes down from Mycenae, she goes to what she thinks is going to be her wedding, and she's actually seized by her father Agamemnon. She's pulled onto an altar, and she is slaughtered like an animal in front of the Greeks. And immediately after this happens, the winds pick up, and so the men, seemingly without missing a beat, get in the ships, and they leave for Troy. Coming back from that really dark note though, the Battle of Troy actually spans for 10 whole years. So the Iliad, which is by Homer, this is our main source material for the war. This only covers a really small window in the 9th year of the battle. So this is only about like 8 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks of the war itself. And from Homer, we know that the war was equally weighted for the last 10 years, that, you have moments of the Trojans that were doing really well, you've got moments of the Greeks doing really well, but Homer tells us from the first paragraph, really, that the Greeks will ultimately win. Despite the struggle, the Greeks are going to come out on top. So the action of the Iliad itself actually drops us into an argument between Achilles and Agamemnon. Prior to the written narrative of the Iliad, Achilles and his Myrmidons had sacked a town that was nearby to Troy, and part of the prizes and the war booty that the men take from said town includes women. And so there's a very beautiful woman, a very important woman from this town by the name of Briseis, and the Myrmidons and the army give Briseis to Achilles as, you know, a sort of symbol of his pride, of his bravery, of his courage, of his amazing warrior honor, all of this sort of stuff, right? So Briseis is a prize and is gifted by the whole army to Achilles. Around the same time, though, Agamemnon is also taking a war prize of his own, who is a priestess of Apollo by the name of Chryseis, and this is where everything goes downhill. So Chryseis' father, being a priest of Apollo himself, he goes to try and negotiate his daughter's safe return from Agamemnon, but Agamemnon takes this as an insult, unsurprisingly, and he tells him, essentially, to go away, right? He basically is just like, this is massively disrespectful that you've come this far anyways, just go home. And so he then, Chryseis, prays to Apollo, notifies Apollo to what's been going on, and Apollo is not happy because both of them are his servers, for lack of a better word, because they are priests and priestess of him. So Apollo, being the god of medicine and disease, Apollo decides to punish the Greeks for Agamemnon's behavior, and he rains a plague down on the Greek camp. So this starts with, you know, the animals dying, and then all of a sudden the people start dying, and everybody starts noticing this, and they're like, what is going on? So, much like at Aulis, the seer Calchas, he is consulted, and he then goes to the gods to go and ask what's wrong, and then he relays to the Greeks, and more specifically to Agamemnon, but he relays it in an assembly that we do see in the Iliad. And he says that all of this is Agamemnon's fault, because he must return Chryseis to her father, because by keeping her, Agamemnon is not offending Chryseis, but is offending Apollo himself. So Agamemnon, naturally, he does put up a fight about this, but ultimately he does agree, and he says that he'll give Chryseis back to her father, but will replace Chryseis as his war prize with Achilles' war prize, Briseis, who I just mentioned. So that way Agamemnon is not prizeless. Achilles throws his really famous tantrum in this moment and refuses to fight until Agamemnon apologizes, until Agamemnon returns Briseis, and Agamemnon must then grovel for Achilles to come back into battle. In fact, Achilles goes so far as to ask the gods to aid the Trojans in battle so the Greek army will learn to appreciate him more, right? That is literally, he goes to his mother, he says, Thetis, you've got to go and tell Zeus, make sure that lots of the Greeks die so that they really do appreciate me as a warrior. It's really, really questionable behavior by Achilles, but that's him. Now we're going to jump ahead yet again on this mythological timeline to meet Achilles' best bud, Patroclus, who then shows up one day because he is really fed up with Achilles refusing to fight, and Achilles further refuses any of his men, whom Patroclus is one of them, to go into the war as well, because all of them want to go back into war, okay? All of them are warriors, they're all there for a reason, and now they're all just sort of sitting around the camp, each of them in their own little like blanket burritos. They're really fucking bored, okay? Another Greek by the name of Nestor, he actually gives the idea to Patroclus to put on Achilles' armor and pretend to be him just to scare the Trojans a little bit, just to give the Greeks a little bit more time. Nestor suggests that Patroclus comes out so he looks like Achilles, and therefore the Trojans will push back and it will give the Greeks enough time to sort of, you know, advance on the Trojans and gain some more land back. Patroclus presents this idea to Achilles. Achilles begrudgingly agrees, which is unfortunate because he does make Patroclus in this moment promise not to fight Hector. He says, you can do whatever the hell you want, just appear on the battlefield, but don't touch Hector, kill whoever the hell else you want to. Not him. I'm coming to Hector. And again, unfortunately, Patroclus does agree, even though Patroclus does the one thing that he was asked not to do, and he goes to meet Hector on the battlefield. He kills like 50 people in this moment, and then at the last sort of rung, he could have easily gone back to the camp. He chooses not to. He fights Hector, and he does fall by Hector's spear. When the news is presented to Achilles by a character by the name of Antilochus, Achilles does not react well, okay? He falls to his knees, he tugs at his hair, he beats his breast, he's screaming, the whole lot, okay? Achilles is so enraged that his pain drives him to go back into battle. But since Patroclus had been wearing his armor, right, to look like Achilles, he had put on Achilles' armor, that now Achilles needs new armor, and so he gets a whole new set that is made by the Greek god of ironworks, whose name is Hephaestus, and Hephaestus fashions this beautiful armor for him. And so Achilles goes back into battle with his new armor, his new shield, and he, lots of things actually happen when Achilles gets back into battle that we don't talk about enough. He fights a literal river at one point. His horses speak to him and prophesize his death. There's a whole thing, but either way, he goes out to fight Hector in order to avenge Patroclus. Now, initially, when Hector and Achilles meet on the battlefield, Hector does what any sane person would do when encountering Achilles, right? So he sees Achilles, he goes, "Not today, Satan!" And he turns around and he books it, right? Hector runs. But eventually, after they do, I think it's like 3 laps of Troy. They run around 3 times. Achilles is like, "Fight me!" And Hector's like, "Fine!" So they then end up meeting, and obviously when they meet in combat, Achilles does kill the Trojan prince, and he does the really famous thing where he punches the holes in the bottom. I'm looking down at my heels just so that you guys know. He punches a hole in the bottom of Hector's heels, and then he tugs a leather strap through them, ties Hector to the back of his chariot, and he rides back to the Greek camp. He actually rides around Troy a bunch of times first, and then rides back to the Greek camp, and Hector's body is bobbing behind him the whole time. And as he does this, Hector's family and his loved ones are watching from the walls of Troy. The king of Troy, whose name is Priam, he does go to Achilles in the middle of the night in the Iliad. This is the last part of the Iliad. He goes to beg for his son's body back. Now, the pair then, Achilles and Priam, they have this private chat. They have a period where they both cry together, and they do agree that Priam can have Hector's body back, and that they will also have a period of time where no one will fight one another, so that each side can correctly honor and respect their dead from their specific armies. Now, Priam leaves the camp. He leaves Achilles' tent with Hector, who looks like Hector, by the way. He is not in shreds. This is important because his body is protected by the gods in the Iliad. So he's not shreds. He's not just bone at this point. He still looks like Hector. So that's the body that Priam brings back to Troy with him. And the Iliad ends with the funeral of Hector. Hector's body is brought back into the city. He's anointed. He's then put on a pyre. And that is literally the last line of the book itself. But luckily for us, the legend of Troy does continue thanks to the second book in the series from Homer, which is called the Odyssey, and also later mythology like the Aeneid, which also recounts the sacking of Troy itself. There is one book that is lost to us, but we know about it in reference and thanks to pottery depictions, that when the battle resumes after the death of Hector, that the Trojans are losing really badly at this point because Achilles is back, remember? And so because they are losing, they actually call on the Amazons, who are daughters of Ares and a female race of warriors, right? So they're really, really valuable. They come to aid the Trojans in war. And we know this specifically because there is an actual piece of pottery with Achilles killing Penthesilea, who is the queen of the Amazons. And again, this is referenced from a lot of other people in ancient literature, even though we do not have this book. But we know, this is important, we know that Achilles kills the queen of the Amazons at the Battle of Troy. But when it comes to the death of Achilles himself, the mythology here is a little bit murky yet again. There are lots of different versions of this death. Now, we know that Achilles was certainly shot by Paris. Okay, so without a doubt, Paris is the man who kills Achilles, and he does so with an arrow. He shoots him with a bow and arrow. However, the details of this event differ greatly in the ancient source material. Sometimes the arrow is dipped in poison, sometimes it's just guided by Apollo, sometimes the arrow hits Achilles in the heel, right? That's much later mythology, which is attached onto, Thetis when Achilles was a baby, dipping him into the river Styx. And so the only place that you can kill him is his heel. That's much, much later. But either way, that's one version of it, that he was shot in the heel the first time. Some say that he was shot in the heel and then in the chest. Some say that he was never shot in the heel at all and he was just shot in the chest. It's a lot. There's a lot of differing events is the point that I'm trying to tell you. That lots of people say this differently. What you need to know is that Paris definitely kills Achilles. Paris definitely does it with an arrow, but the details are a little bit more difficult. So Achilles dies before the walls of Troy fall. So Achilles does not see Troy fall. He just gets the Greeks very, very close, and then he dies. And actually, when Achilles dies, his son, Pyrrhus, because when he was on that island, when I told you that he was hiding, he did impregnate one of the ladies. So he had a child with one of the ladies there, and his son Pyrrhus comes because I think he's in his 20s, or like in his mid to late 20s, early 20s maybe, I have no idea, I'm just making that up. He's definitely old enough though to go to war. He's not a child, he's an old enough adult, and he goes to war in place of Achilles. So he sort of slots into what Achilles would be doing towards the end of the war. So Pyrrhus makes his little appearance. But you might be asking now, well, how did Troy fall? We've gotten all the way up to Achilles dying, Troy still hasn't fallen, what happens then? Thankfully, the Aeneid, which comes much later from Roman mythology, does sort of tack in a lot of these details that we don't have from the ancient Greek source material. So it's said that the Greeks were so fed up, they were so frustrated with fighting for so long, it's been 10 years, that Odysseus comes up with the final attempt to end the war and for the Greeks to be victorious, and that is the wooden horse. So the Greeks build this giant wooden beast of a horse thing, but it's hollow in the middle. And so they then decide to climb into it, to have the best heroes climb into the wooden horse and hide there. And the rest of the Greeks get back into their boats and they go to hide behind the island of Tenedos, which is close by. So it looks like the Greek camp has been abandoned and the only thing that's left there is this giant horse that seemingly looks like an offering to a goddess. Now, along with the horse, the Greeks also leave one of their men who goes by the name of Sinon, and Sinon's whole job is to convince the Trojans to get the horse into the city, because in the horse we've got Menelaus, Agamemnon, Pyrrhus, Achilles' son, we've got Odysseus, we've got all of the most important heroes in there, and Sinon has to convince the Trojans that this is not a trap and that actually this is an offering to a goddess and that they would, benefit from taking it into the city. So that is what Sinon does. When Sinon is found by a bunch of shepherds and he's brought to King Priam, this is his time to spew shit to the Trojans, okay? So he tells them all of this fake drama, which includes the Greeks having tried to sacrifice Sinon as a human sacrifice, which was seen as like a totally inhumane thing to do. Like the whole Iphigenia episode is a really odd one in mythology. But Sinon then tries to convince the Trojans that he managed to escape as being this human sacrifice. He's been running around and he's so tired, but he clearly has beef with the Greeks. He can't go home because the Greeks hate him now because he ran away from being this human sacrifice. All of this sort of stuff. There's a lot of drama in this scene. And Priam hears all of it and he really feels for Sinon. And so he says to Sinon, look, you, as far as I'm concerned, are now a Trojan, but in exchange for your life, you need to tell us what this wooden horse is for and what we should be doing with it, because you know, and because they wanted to kill you, we know that you're not going to lie to us. So if you want to live, you're going to tell us this. And Sinon says, okay. And he tells them that the wooden horse is actually an offering to Athena. And that is because Odysseus and Diomedes had taken a wooden statue of Athena from a temple from nearby that Athena was basically not happy about. And the whole statue started having like fire for eyes and all of this sort of stuff, not happy. And so the way that they were going to then appease Athena was to build this giant horse in honor of her. However, this horse must be left as an offering to the goddess, and the best way for the Trojans to punish the Greeks would be to take this offering into the city, because that way, then Athena will get offended, it is not then for her, the Trojans will have it, and then the Greeks will get a final FU when they're back in Greece. So that's what Sinon tells them. And as Sinon is spewing all of this stuff, the Trojans are starting to get convinced, yeah, we should bring it into the city. There's this priest called Laocoon, who you guys might know from the statue. Laocoon comes bumbling out from Troy and he's screaming and he's like, it's a trap! Absolutely not! Do not let this thing into the city! It's probably hollow on the inside. There are Greek heroes in there! No! And he actually fires a spear into the belly of the horse. And it's done with such force, you guys, that actually it starts like reverberating when it lands into the wood. And I always wonder what was going on in the horse when all of a sudden the spear comes barreling through, that all the Greeks who were sitting there with their backs up against the wooden horse were like, shit. Anywho, because Laocoon does this, sort of in the same moment that then these two serpents come up from the sea and they actually kill Laocoon and his two sons, which unfortunately the Trojans do not hear what Laocoon is saying because he's totally right. But instead they see this as a sign from the gods that because Laocoon had harmed this, honoring to a goddess, that now he was being punished for harming this offering. And so therefore they bring the wooden horse into the city, exactly what the Greeks want them to do. And they have these whole festivities, because remember, they think that they've won, right? So the Trojans are celebrating. They're like, look at this giant horse. Look at what we've done. We're amazing. All of this sort of stuff. And at night, Sinon comes out of his sleeping quarters in Troy and he opens up the wooden horse and all of the really famous Greek heroes come tumbling out. And the first things that they do is that they kill the guards for the gate and they open up the gates of the city. And then the rest of the army have now come back from hiding behind an island. They come back and they rush into the city and they completely burn Troy to the ground and they win the war. Now, according to the mythology, we know how a lot of different characters die or how they end, right? So that's very important to know the continuation of mythology and the story and all of that sort of stuff. So we know that Priam, who's the king of Troy, he is slaughtered by Pyrrhus, Achilles' son, during the raid. And then we have Paris, who is killed by a hero called Philoctetes, who this appears in a play much later. That's how we know that Paris dies, because he, as I said before, he does kill Achilles, then he's killed by Philoctetes. Aeneas is another character from the Trojan War, but he makes it out alive. He actually escapes the burning Troy to go and continue Troy in foreign lands, and he ends up founding the future site of Rome. So that's how Rome came to be. But that's Aeneas. And then we have other women who survive, well, the majority of women who survive, because they are all taken as war prizes. So the women like Hecuba, we have Andromache, who's Hector's wife. All of these ladies do survive, and they go with the Greeks back to Greece as war prizes for them. And lots of our heroes, we also know lots of the Greek heroes do make it home, right? So they make it home safe and sound. We know that heroes like Odysseus, right? Odysseus takes 10 years. That is detailed in the Odyssey. He takes 10 years to make it home. Whereas heroes like Agamemnon, he makes it home quite quickly in comparison to Odysseus. Everybody makes it home quite quickly in comparison to Odysseus. But Agamemnon makes it home quite quickly, but he brings back a concubine in Cassandra, who's a daughter of Priam. She also is cursed. That's a whole other story, but he brings her back, and he is met actually by his wife, who then kills him in the bathtub immediately. Like, as soon as he walks through the door, she has been having all of this anger for the whole Iphigenia incident. Clytemnestra has been harboring that for 10 years. She had a whole affair with his cousin, mind you, because she's like, fuck that guy back in Troy. Has a whole affair with Aegisthus. Agamemnon walks through the door and she kills him in the bathtub. But what happens to Helen? You guys are probably wondering, well, this is the woman that supposedly caused the whole war. What happens to her? Now, we do hear that Menelaus does want to kill Helen himself. So he has banned anybody else from getting near Helen. He refuses to let any of them get close to her because he wants to be the one to do the deed. And when they are raiding Troy, he actually finds her. He finds her in private, and this is his moment. Okay, he's waited for 10 years to do this, you guys. He walks up to Helen. Helen starts panicking because she knows he's gonna kill me. So what does Helen do? She does what anybody would probably do in this moment when you're like, it's life or death at this moment. I don't know what to do. So she drops her top and she bares her breasts to Menelaus. And Menelaus panics because he's just like, oh my god, tits, and then he doesn't kill her. I kid you I could not make that up. That is mythology, and that is how that story ends. And actually, that's how the raid of Troy ends. Those are all of our important characters. So, ta-da! Here's the mythology. So now that we've gone through both stories together as a family, I do think it's pretty obvious, and I hope that you guys can see how obvious it is that these stories are incredibly, incredibly different. Okay, so the film Troy tells a completely different version to the one that I just told you in the mythology. And therefore, it would be really, really easy for me as a classicist to simply look at the film Troy and say, where the f did any of this come from? This is not the ancient source material. Why would you do this? And believe me, it's a really hard thing for me to rein myself in to not just do that. But I've realized that it's not going to be a well-weighted video, as I've said before, if I do just do that. And so therefore, we are going to keep this very, very balanced. Instead of me just coming in and bashing the film just left, right, and center, we are going to be breaking up the film into lots of teeny tiny pieces, finding what the film did well and what it did not do well in order to give it some credit and in order to understand both sides, because I really hope that that comes across anyways, and I think that that is the best form of action really for this whole series. So thank you guys so much for tuning into this video. I know this one was super long. The videos following this will not be as long as this one, but thank you guys so much, and I hope that you guys enjoy the future series, A Case for Troy. So we'll see you in the next episode. See you then.